The tone around Berea changed the moment somebody put a very simple question in front of a room full of people who watch this Browns quarterback competition for a living. If the season opener were tomorrow, who's your starter? And the answer that came back wasn't the safe one. It wasn't the veteran with the Pro Bowl resume and the 9 years of NFL scar tissue. It was the rookie. It was Shedeur Sanders. That's the moment I want to start with, because once that sentence gets said out loud by people inside the building, you can't unsay it. The competition stops being theoretical, and it stops being something Cleveland can wave off as camp noise. Here's what's been building underneath the surface all camp. Deshaun Watson has been getting the first-team reps. On paper, that's the whole story. Veteran gets the ones, rookie waits his turn. Business as usual for an August practice schedule. But the people actually charting these sessions every single day are starting to notice something that doesn't line up with who's technically running with the starters. They're watching Watson process the game, and what they're describing isn't confidence, it's hesitation, a tick slow, a guy who sees the window and, instead of trusting it, second guesses it before the ball comes out. One evaluator who's been at every practice, this can't put it about as plainly as you can put it. There's a hitch in him right now, a reluctance to pull the trigger, and nobody watching is totally sure whether it's mental or physical. That distinction matters more than people give it credit for, because a physical issue is something you rehab and move past. A trust issue at the quarterback position is a completely different animal, and it's the kind of thing that shows up on tape long before anyone in the building says it out loud in a press conference. And that's exactly the gap that's opened up in this competition. When a quarterback hesitates for even half a second in the NFL, the geometry of the entire play changes underneath him. A receiver who was open a beat ago is suddenly blanketed. A throw that should have been out on time turns into a check down, or worse, turns into a hit on the quarterback because the pocket collapsed while he was still deciding. One extra count of indecision doesn't just cost a single play, it costs rhythm. And rhythm is the entire foundation Todd Monken is trying to build this offense around. Watson has the resume for this. He's seen disguised NFL coverages before. He's operated under real pressure in real games. He's supposed to be the guy in that quarterback room who processes fastest, not the guy multiple people are now describing as thinking his way through progressions that used to be instinctive for him. Now flip it to the other quarterback in that room, and the story reads almost like a mirror image of Watson's. Shedeur Sanders isn't gaining ground in this competition because Cleveland handed him anything. He worked his way into this conversation one practice at a time, going all the way back to OTAs. Back when the honest expectation around the building was that he'd spend this year watching, absorbing, and developing on the side. Back then, the gap between him and Watson looked exactly like what you'd expect between a rookie and a 9-year veteran quarterback. But somewhere in that stretch of off-season work, that gap started shrinking, and it didn't shrink because of one flashy throw or one clip that went viral on social media. It shrank because the ball started coming out on time. The reads got cleaner. The confidence started showing up in small ways, the kind of things that don't make highlight reels but absolutely show up on the coach's film. He started throwing with anticipation instead of waiting to physically confirm a receiver was open, and that transition is one of the hardest a young quarterback ever has to make, because it means trusting information before you can fully see it confirmed. That's not arm talent, that's processing speed. And processing speed is supposed to be Watson's built-in advantage as the guy who's already played 9 full NFL seasons. Minicamp didn't slow any of that progress down either, and that part matters. Minicamp is exactly where coaches find out whether a strong OTA stretch was real growth or just a handful of lucky practices strung together, because the installs get denser and the tempo jumps. Shedeur kept building through it. He closed out one 2-minute drill with a deep sideline shot and then a fade route for a touchdown to a receiver he trusts. The kind of finish that gets an entire quarterback room talking on the walk back into the building. And by the time training camp actually opened, the conversation around him had already shifted. Nobody was really debating anymore whether he could survive in this competition. The question had become whether he could actually win it outright. That's an enormous jump in expectation for any player at any position, and once that shift happens, every single practice afterwards starts carrying more weight than the one before it. Here's what makes all of this so uncomfortable for Cleveland right now, and I don't think you can overstate it. If this were genuinely a one-sided competition, if Watson were clearly and consistently outplaying a developing rookie, there wouldn't be a story here at all. The veteran would keep every rep with the ones, the kid would keep developing quietly in the background, and everybody covering this team would move on to other storylines in August. That is not what's happening in Berea right now. Instead, you're getting this pattern on repeat, almost like clockwork. Shedeur makes a big throw, and the building reacts. Watson answers with a strong rep of his own the next series. Shedeur shows command of the huddle and gets the offense moving. And then the coaches shift opportunity right back toward Watson. It's a genuine tug of war, and every swing of it becomes its own talking point. Because in a competition this tight, opportunity starts to matter almost as much as raw performance does. And that's exactly where I think people need to be careful about how they read those first team reps, because it's tempting, it's honestly the natural instinct, to look at who's running with the ones on a given day and assume that answers who's starting week 1. But training camp isn't a scoreboard. It's closer to a laboratory. Coaches move personnel combinations around constantly because they're testing very specific things. They want to know if a quarterback's timing changes when he's throwing to the starting receivers instead of the twos. They want to isolate whether a missed connection was actually the quarterback's fault, or the route, or the protection, or just unfamiliar chemistry between two guys who haven't logged enough reps together yet. So when Watson keeps getting run with the starters, even as outside observers keep pointing toward Shedeur's rise, there's a real possibility that Cleveland isn't rewarding Watson at all with those reps. They might be demanding answers from him instead, putting him in the best possible situation, top receivers, first-team protection, ideal circumstances, specifically to see whether he can finally create the separation everybody assumed he'd have created months ago, back when this competition was supposed to be closer to a formality. Because think about what it actually means if he doesn't create that separation. If Watson has every structural advantage available to him inside that quarterback room, and the kid drafted a year ago to sit and develop behind him is still hanging right there in the competition anyway, that's not neutral information for the coaching staff. That tells Monken something concrete. It tells him the hierarchy this team walked into training camp with might not hold up once it actually gets tested under real scrutiny. This is also where I have to push back on some of the noise surrounding Shedeur that has nothing to do with football whatsoever. I keep hearing people bring up the people around him, the size of his circle, who's showing up with him to the building. I genuinely don't care about any of that, and I think it's a distraction from the only two things that should actually matter in this evaluation. Is he out in his community committing crimes? No! By every account coming out of Cleveland, he's been a positive presence off the field. Can he play winning football at the position when it counts? That's the entire evaluation right there, and it's the only one that should count toward anything. He can bring 50 people into a team meeting with him if that's what he wants to do. None of that moves the needle 1 inch on whether he can operate this offense on a Sunday in September. What does move the needle is the stuff people inside the building keep bringing up completely unprompted. That he's not afraid to ask a question in a meeting room, even if it means momentarily looking like he doesn't already know the answer. That sounds like a small thing on the surface, but it isn't. Most young players, especially quarterbacks operating under this level of public scrutiny, would rather stay quiet than risk looking unprepared in front of teammates and coaches. Shedeur apparently doesn't operate that way at all. If he's not certain about something, he asks, and he doesn't seem to spend much energy worrying about how that looks from the outside. That's exactly the kind of trait that predicts whether a young quarterback actually closes the mental gap in this league, because the players who ask the uncomfortable questions in the room are usually the ones who don't make the same mistake twice on the field. Now, Watson's side of this deserves real context, too, because it would be unfair to turn this into a pure pile-on without acknowledging the nuance. Some of the roughest practices being described sound less like a talent problem and more like a rhythm problem. A guy who reportedly looked genuinely off in one padded practice with no live defense involved, and then turned around and threw the ball noticeably better the very next day. That inconsistency is its own red flag, and honestly, it might be a bigger one than a single bad practice would be on its own. Was it fatigue? Was something bothering him physically that hasn't been reported publicly? Was it simply the jump in adrenaline that comes with a fuller, faster practice tempo? Nobody watching from the outside seems totally sure, and that uncertainty itself is part of the problem. You'd expect more stability and more consistency from a quarterback with 9 years in this league, and the fact that people are seriously asking these questions about him at all says something about how unsettled this entire competition has genuinely become. And that unsettled feeling is exactly why Todd Monken is, in my opinion, the most important person in this whole story right now, not because of anything he's actually said publicly, but because of the position he's actually sitting in behind the scenes. He's not simply choosing between two names on a printed depth chart. He's trying to figure out which quarterback lets him run the specific offense he wants to run, and that offense, based on everything he's emphasized in his own public comments, needs decisiveness above almost every other quality. The ball has to come out on trust, not on confirmation. The quarterback has to attack the window the instant it appears, not a half second later once it's already started closing. That's precisely why the reports about Watson hesitating downfield carry so much weight right now. It's not some minor technical footnote, it's a direct conflict with the exact quality this entire scheme is built around. And it's precisely why Shedeur's willingness to push the ball down the field, even working with a smaller sample of reps and often lesser personnel around him, keeps forcing a comparison that Cleveland would probably prefer to avoid making this early into the process. Here's the part I think gets lost in all the back and forth about reps and rotations. The pressure in this competition has fully flipped sides from where it started back in the spring. Shedeur came into this year as the guy who had to prove he even belonged in the conversation. He's done that already. Now Watson is the one who has to prove why he should still be considered ahead of him, and that is a fundamentally different kind of pressure to play under than the one Watson expected to be carrying this August. Shedeur doesn't need Cleveland to hand him anything at this point in the process. He just needs the two quarterbacks judged by the exact same standard, snap for snap, mistake for mistake, opportunity for opportunity. If that standard actually gets applied honestly and consistently, the rep distribution eventually has to catch up to what's happening on the field, because at some point Monken can't keep leaning on the phrase open competition without the actual reps backing that phrase up in a way people can see. And I don't think that moment is especially far off anymore. There's context surrounding this whole situation that makes it feel bigger than a normal quarterback battle too. This is a Browns roster that traded away Myles Garrett with an eye toward getting noticeably younger across the board, that invested a real draft asset in Sanders a year ago specifically because they believed in the long-term upside, and that has Watson still working through the tail end of a contract situation that's already been one of the most scrutinized storylines in this entire organization for years now. Every one of those threads adds real weight to a decision that was never going to be simple for Cleveland in the first place, no matter how this camp had played out. What happens next comes down to two very direct questions, and both quarterbacks still control their own half of the answer completely. For Shedeur, the formula is simple on paper, even if it's genuinely hard to execute in practice. Keep attacking, keep taking care of the football, and make every single rep he does get essentially impossible to ignore. He doesn't need to dominate one practice or produce one viral highlight. He just needs to keep making it harder for Cleveland to leave him on the bench next week than it was this week. That's how young quarterbacks actually force their way into starting jobs in this league. Not with talk, not with hype. With enough accumulated good football that the coaching staff eventually runs out of reasons to keep waiting. For Watson, the challenge is just as clear, and honestly, just as uncomfortable to sit with. If those first team reps are going to keep coming his way, he has to turn them into real, visible separation. He has to look like the quarterback who's earning that advantage every single day, not simply the quarterback who arrived in camp already holding it. Because every practice where he gets the better opportunity and still doesn't clearly pull away, Shedeur's case quietly gets a little stronger by default, whether Watson does anything specifically wrong that day or not. That's the trap of being the incumbent in a competition this tight. Standing still starts to look an awful lot like losing ground. Cleveland wanted a real quarterback competition heading into this camp, and based on everything coming out of Berea right now, that's exactly what they've gotten. A lot closer than most people expected back when the pads first went on in late July. The only real question left is how much longer this coaching staff can keep publicly calling it open before the reps on the practice field start saying something noticeably different than the official depth chart does.